In the glittering world of wealth and prestige, not every jewel that sparkles is flawless. Behind the velvet curtains of high society galas and lavish mansions, real intentions twist quietly in the dark. When billionaire Ethan Montgomery, a captivating tech tycoon, betrayed his stunning pregnant wife Charlotte with none other than her lifelong best friend, no one imagined what she would do next. People expected heartbreak and tears. But Charlotte was not just any woman. Instead of letting her pain shatter her, she crafted a careful plan, driven by justice and revenge. Neither Ethan nor that so-called friend had the slightest idea that Charlotte's quiet strength could match any storm, and her revenge would strip them of everything from the outside in. To everyone else, Ethan Montgomery and Charlotte Harris were the picture of a perfect fairy tale. Ethan, heir to the prestigious Montgomery estate nestled in Napa Valley, had multiplied his family's fortune through bold tech investments in Silicon Valley, building sleek skyscrapers that carried his name. Charlotte was the beloved daughter of acclaimed fashion designer Helen Harris, whose gowns once turned heads on runways in Paris and Milan. Their wedding, orchestrated by the sought-after planner Olivia Grant, famous for hosting events for Beyoncé, had been the event of the year. Charlotte's beauty was the talk of their circle. Long caramel hair falling gracefully over her shoulders, eyes the color of deep sapphires, and a figure that made strangers stop and stare. But more than anything, it was her kindness that everyone adored. She had a genuine warmth and an open smile that made people feel instantly welcome. Yet under that warmth lay a quiet truth Charlotte never confessed to anyone. Sometimes, late at night, she wondered if she was truly enough for a man like Ethan. She had always felt a step behind his world of generational power and ruthless ambition. She, the daughter of an artist, trying to belong among tech titans and old money. To keep that place, she made herself perfect, gracious, supportive, trusting to a fault. Those closest to her believed she was pure-hearted to a fault, someone who would never suspect betrayal from those she loved most. At 35, Ethan had an undeniable presence that filled any room. Tall, broad-shouldered, and carrying himself with a calm authority, he moved like modern royalty. His steady, commanding voice alone could sway investors and attract global partners without effort. He claimed to love Charlotte, or so it seemed, but he also craved the thrill of new conquests, whether behind office doors or beyond. That evening, as Charlotte stood in front of her vanity preparing for a charity gala at a luxurious downtown hotel, she gently laid her hand on her slightly rounded belly. 3 months pregnant, the change was small but deeply felt. This baby, their first, was everything she had dreamed of since the day they said, "I do." The changes were still subtle, but she felt them deeply. This child, their first, was the dream she had carried in her heart since the day she married Ethan. On her vanity table sat her sapphire stud earrings, a gift Ethan had given her the night they found out about the baby. The promise of a brand new chapter glowed in their sparkle. Earlier that day, Ethan had been tied up in a high-stakes meeting to finalize a major software acquisition. He was running behind schedule, and when Charlotte tried calling him, each attempt went straight to voicemail. In the past, she might have panicked, maybe even felt a stab of jealousy. But after years standing faithfully beside her billionaire husband, she trusted he would always come through for her. Still, as she set her phone down, a quiet voice deep inside whispered old insecurities she hated to admit. What if you're not enough to hold his focus anymore? What if the world he lives in always tempts him with something shinier, younger, more thrilling? She pressed a hand to her belly and forced herself to breathe, reminding herself she was being silly. Ethan adored her. He always had. She had no clue that behind closed doors something much darker was unraveling. Smiling to herself, Charlotte wondered if her childhood best friend, Madison Price, would show up at the gala tonight. Madison had been her rock since middle school, the one person Charlotte believed would never break her trust. Little did she know that the people she trusted most were about to rip her world apart in the cruelest way. The charity gala was breathtaking. Soft music drifted through the grand ballroom, mingling with the quiet chatter of Silicon Valley's elite. Crystal chandeliers floated above round tables, covered in pristine white linens. Society photographers moved discreetly through the crowd, snapping candid shots of the most influential names in tech and finance. Between the clinking of champagne glasses and the low hum of polite laughter, Charlotte found herself scanning the room for Ethan. He still hadn't arrived, despite his promise. In Charlotte's circle, punctuality at charity events wasn't just polite, it was expected. A missing spouse made people whisper. And more pressing? Where was Madison Price? She hadn't answered any of Charlotte's texts all afternoon. Charlotte sank into her assigned seat, her stomach tight with a knot of worry. She took slow sips of water to steady her nerves, resting her hand on her belly to soothe the tiny life growing inside her. Ethan will be here, she whispered under her breath. He always is. But as minutes turned into hours, there was still no sign of Ethan or Madison. Restless, Charlotte thanked her gracious host, excused herself quietly, and slipped outside for a breath of fresh air. The doorman recognized her instantly and signaled for the valet. But Ethan's private driver was nowhere in sight. Casting one last glance at the Grand Hotel entrance, Charlotte made up her mind to go home alone. She could have asked any of her well-connected friends for a ride, but a strange, aching need for solitude pulled her toward the quiet of home. She craved the quiet of her own home, far from the glitter and gossip, so she could collect her thoughts. That was when her phone buzzed. An unfamiliar number lit up the screen. "Ethan is cheating on you. Ask Madison." Her heart slammed against her ribs. She read the message over and over, her mind spinning. This had to be a cruel prank or some random spam. But who would go that far? A storm of anxiety, disbelief, and raw hurt coiled inside her. She tried calling Madison first. No answer. She dialed Ethan next, straight to voicemail. By the time Charlotte climbed into a cab, she was shaking. Could it be true? Could the man she adored, the father of her unborn child, really betray her like this? Deep down, a quiet voice whispered that the text might be a sign, a warning she couldn't brush aside. By the time she reached the Grand Montgomery penthouse, the panic had hardened into a dull, relentless ache. Her designer heels echoed through the silent hallway as she stepped into the massive living room. Darkness wrapped the space, broken only by the city skyline glittering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Alone in the shadowy calm, Charlotte sank onto a plush sofa, phone tight in her hand. She called Madison again. Nothing. She called Ethan. Still nothing. The text glared back at her like an accusation. With trembling fingers, she stroked her belly and whispered, "I hope this isn't real." She longed for an explanation, something, anything to tell her that her life wasn't crumbling beneath her feet. But deep down she could feel it. The first cracks in her perfect world. Morning brought a cruel kind of clarity. Charlotte woke to soft sunlight spilling through the penthouse windows, her eyes heavy from a night of restless sleep. She reached for her phone. Still no messages from Ethan or Madison. Fear and anger churned low in her stomach. Normally, Ethan would be at the sleek marble breakfast bar, scrolling through emails with a mug of strong black coffee. Predictable, dependable. But as she drifted through the quiet apartment, there was no sign of him. She thought about calling his office, but paused. What would I even say? "Hi, have you seen my husband who might be cheating on me?" The idea felt absurd and humiliating. Determined not to drown in panic, Charlotte splashed cold water on her face, changed into a simple blouse and jeans, and decided to pay Madison an unannounced visit. The doorman outside Madison's high-rise condo in Palo Alto recognized Charlotte instantly and let her up without hesitation. When she reached Madison's floor, she noticed the apartment door was slightly ajar, something that struck Charlotte as oddly out of place. She pushed it open gently, her voice low and careful. "Madison, are you here? Are you here?" The living room was a mess, pillows scattered, a glass tipped over on the coffee table, shoes tossed carelessly by the couch. Heart pounding, Charlotte stepped further inside, drawn toward the faint sound of hushed voices coming from the bedroom. Before she could fully gather her thoughts, Madison appeared in the hallway, wrapped in a silky robe, hair tousled and cheeks flushed with unmistakable guilt. The moment Madison saw Charlotte standing there, she froze. Charlotte? What are you doing here?" she stammered, her eyes darting toward the bedroom door. Charlotte's mouth felt dry as sand. She forced herself to hold steady, though her mind buzzed with 1,000 questions. "I was worried. You didn't show up last night, and then I got a strange text. Is Ethan here?" Charlotte's words trembled only slightly. Madison's eyes widened in panic. She opened her mouth to say something, anything, but before she could, Ethan himself stepped out from the bedroom behind her. His shirt hung open, his hair a mess. The second he saw Charlotte, he stopped cold. For one suspended heartbeat, Charlotte could hear nothing but the thunder of her pulse. She felt her legs weaken as a brutal truth slammed into her chest, louder than any words could ever confess. In that single glance, every promise, every vow, every whispered "I love you" turned to dust inside her ribcage. A raw ache pulsed behind her eyes, begging to spill out, but she forced it down with a gasp that sounded more like a broken sob caught in her throat. It hit Charlotte like a slow-motion blow to the chest. The room seemed to tilt around her. She clutched the back of a nearby chair to steady herself, a sharp, freezing shock pricking her skin. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was betrayal in its rawest, ugliest form. The best friend she had trusted with every secret, and the husband she loved beyond reason, stood side by side, their guilt painted clearly across their faces. For a moment, no one moved. Silence pressed down heavier than any words could. Then, without a word, Charlotte spun on her heel, her breathing jagged. She ignored their desperate calls of her name as she stormed toward the door. Each step felt like wading through quicksand, but she forced herself forward. She didn't cry, not yet. Only a blazing, poisonous rage pulsed through her veins. Flashes of her and Madison giggling at sleepovers as teenagers flickered in her mind, overlapped with the memory of Ethan slipping a wedding band onto her finger with the promise of forever. How had it come to this? She stepped into the elevator, hot tears threatening to spill, but she refused to let them win. In that moment, something inside her hardened, a cold, unwavering resolve. She was done being the naive one. If Ethan and Madison thought they could do this to her while she carried his child, they had made a devastating mistake. Charlotte left Madison's building in a daze, flagging down the first cab she spotted. Settling into the back seat, the numbness of shock started to slip away, replaced by a hurricane of thoughts. How long has this been happening? How could they betray me like this? And what about our baby? She typed out a quick text to her mother, Helen Harris. "We need to talk. Urgent." Within moments, her phone rang. Helen's concerned voice, still carrying the gentle lilt she used when discussing haute couture fabrics, instantly calmed Charlotte's frayed nerves. Without missing a beat, Helen told her to come over right away. Helen Harris's townhouse in Los Altos Hills was a peaceful sanctuary, filled with elegant art, cozy furniture, and a quiet backyard garden Charlotte had adored since childhood. The second she walked through the door, her mother pulled her into a firm embrace, asking nothing until she guided Charlotte to the sofa. At last, the tears broke free. Between ragged sobs, Charlotte poured out everything she had uncovered that morning. Helen listened in stunned silence, her face etched with sorrow. "Oh, my sweet girl, I'm so sorry," she murmured, rubbing Charlotte's back soothingly. "I never trusted Madison. Something about her always felt off to me, but I never imagined Ethan would do this." Helen brought her a steaming cup of chamomile tea, urging her to rest, but rest was the last thing on Charlotte's mind. She wiped her tears on her sleeve, anger clashing with a sharp sting of guilt. How could I have been so blind, she thought bitterly. I let her so close. I trusted too easily, like a fool. For a fleeting moment, she hated herself for handing Madison the knife that carved up her marriage. She needed to piece together the betrayal, both the heartbreak and the money. Her inheritance from her father's side was considerable, but it was nothing compared to the sprawling Montgomery fortune. Ethan's assets were tangled in a maze of shell corporations and trust funds. And then there was the baby. What would this mean for her child's future? All day, as Helen did her best to comfort her, Charlotte's phone buzzed non-stop with calls and texts from Ethan. She ignored everyone. Voicemails stacked up, apologies, excuses, desperate pleas for forgiveness. She deleted them all without listening. Madison tried too, sending frantic texts begging to explain. Charlotte blocked her number without a second thought. By late afternoon, Helen gently suggested they reach out to one of her oldest friends, Richard Langford, a high-powered attorney with a reputation for protecting the city's most powerful families with quiet ferocity. He'll know exactly how to protect you and the baby. Charlotte, Helen said firmly, If Ethan thinks he can walk all over you, he's about to learn he's wrong. That evening, Helen and Charlotte made their way to Richard Langford's law office in downtown Palo Alto. Richard, a composed man in his 50s with neatly trimmed salt and pepper hair and keen, perceptive eyes, welcomed them and listened carefully as Charlotte laid out every detail. "There's no need to rush a divorce just yet," he advised once she finished. "But Charlotte, you must protect your interests as the mother of Ethan's child. You have leverage. If his actions threaten your security or the baby's future, you have every right to take decisive action." Charlotte left Richard's office that night with a folder of paperwork and the seed of a plan taking shape in her mind. She didn't know exactly how this would end, but she knew one thing for sure. She wouldn't stay silent. She wouldn't let Ethan and Madison walk away without consequences. Yet as she sat in the back of the car on the way home, paperwork clutched tight against her chest, a whisper of fear slid through her confidence. What if I fail? What if this fight breaks me instead of them? She drew in a shaky breath, brushing her fingers over her belly. No, she told herself fiercely. This is for my child. I won't back down. She was a Harris, after all, and soon she would be a mother. Her baby deserved a legacy stronger than betrayal. Ethan had never been one to shy away from confrontation in business. He faced deals head-on, even ruthlessly. But when it came to his personal life, he was floundering. Charlotte's icy silence over the past 2 days rattled him more than any screaming match ever could. He had tried to see her at the penthouse, only to discover the locks changed and a private security team that refused him entry. He called Helen Harris, only to be curtly turned away. Even his personal assistant picked up on the tension, as rumors whispered through Montgomery Technology's sleek headquarters. No one could remember the last time the unshakable Ethan Montgomery paced his office, tie loosened, eyes clouded with regret. On the 3rd day, he showed up at the penthouse again, this time finding Charlotte waiting in the living room. She stood by the grand piano, her posture unflinching, her face calm and composed. He couldn't help but notice the gentle curve of her belly, a painfully visible reminder of the life they had created together. He swallowed hard, nerves tightening his chest as he stepped closer. "Charlotte," he began, his voice cracking with desperation. "I'm sorry. I never meant." She lifted a hand, cutting him off coldly. "I don't want your apologies, Ethan." Her tone was controlled, but beneath it he could feel the fire burning. "I want to know why." He ran a trembling hand through his hair, searching for words he knew would never be enough. "It just happened. There's no excuse. I never meant to hurt you. I was lonely. You were so focused on the pregnancy and Madison was. Don't you dare blame this on me, or this baby." Charlotte snapped, her eyes blazing. "You lied to me. You lied to everyone." Ethan lowered his gaze to the floor, shame tightening around his throat like a noose. Shame washed over him. "I know. I'm not trying to make excuses." They stood in heavy silence, the tension thicker than the luxurious curtains draped around them. At last, Charlotte's voice cut through the quiet, her stare unflinching. "I have no intention of letting you off easily. You and Madison betrayed me. You broke our vows. I don't trust you anymore. But for the sake of our baby, I suggest we keep this civil, at least in public." Ethan nodded slowly, a flicker of relief and worry mingling in his eyes. "So, what does that mean? You want a divorce?" Charlotte exhaled, her expression steel solid. "Not yet. I haven't decided, but don't think for a second I'll just accept this. If you expect me to crawl away quietly, think again. I'm a Harris. I know exactly what I'm worth." A hint of panic flickered behind Ethan's calm mask. He knew too well the Harris family was no less powerful than the Montgomery name. In that hushed, tastefully decorated room, he realized Charlotte was no longer the trusting woman he thought he could control. She was becoming someone stronger, someone he might never outmaneuver again. Before he could say another word, she turned sharply toward the door. "Don't contact me unless it's about the baby or something official. I'll decide where this goes next. And don't think Madison is getting away with this. Neither of you has a clue what you've started." With that, she left him standing there. Ethan dropped into a chair, his pulse hammering. He knew better than anyone, an angry Charlotte Harris was a storm no one could contain, and he had just set it loose. True to her word, Charlotte kept her composure in public. She attended charity galas and networking events alone, radiating elegance and calm. When journalists inquired about Ethan, she merely smiled and blamed his absence on urgent business abroad. The rumor mill spun wildly, but no one could confirm the whispers of trouble behind closed doors. Behind the scenes, however, Charlotte was a whirlwind. She had retained Richard Langford to investigate every detail of Ethan's business interests. It didn't take long for Richard to find something damning. Although the Montgomery empire looked rock solid, a significant portion of Ethan's recent ventures were funded by high-risk private loans. Turns out, Ethan had over-leveraged himself to accelerate his latest expansions, taking reckless bets that could topple the whole house of cards if anything went wrong. It was a weak spot Charlotte planned to use to her advantage. If those projects stumbled or lenders lost faith, Ethan could lose everything overnight. And with so much of the Montgomery legacy tied to these ventures, the family's reputation could shatter with him. As for Madison, Charlotte was crafting something far more personal. Quietly digging through old contacts and discreet sources, she discovered her former best friend wasn't nearly as secure as she pretended. Despite her showy lifestyle, Madison's parents had once been well off, but a string of disastrous investments had drained the family's wealth, leaving Madison scrambling to keep up the illusion. So when Ethan came along, flush with money and drawn to reckless thrills, Madison hadn't been able to resist. One evening, Charlotte invited her most trusted inner circle to her mother's house in Los Altos Hills. Among them were old friends like Grace and Fiona, who had known Charlotte and Madison since high school. Over cups of fresh coffee and murmured encouragement, Charlotte laid bare the truth about Ethan and Madison's affair. Gasps and exclamations of disbelief filled the room. Many had long suspected something was off, but hearing it confirmed left them furious on Charlotte's behalf. That night, an unspoken alliance formed. Grace, a savvy PR consultant, knew exactly how to spin a story or leak a rumor that could sway public perception. Fiona, an experienced event planner, had her finger on the pulse of every high-profile gathering from San Francisco to Silicon Valley. Together, they could pull invisible strings to quietly shred Madison's spotless reputation and plant seeds of doubt about Ethan's business empire. But later that night, after everyone had left and the house had gone still, Charlotte sat alone by the garden window, staring into the dark. For a flicker of a moment, she questioned herself. What if this backfires? What if I look vindictive instead of strong? She pressed a palm to her belly, grounding herself in the heartbeat she carried. No, this is for him. For us. And just like that, the hesitation burned away, replaced by resolve sharper than ever. It started subtly, whispers that Ethan's new smart city development was behind schedule. Hints dropped to the right ears that Montgomery Innovations was overextended on risky loans. Anonymous tips sent to gossip sites, linking Madison to shady backdoor deals and unpaid debts. These small, scattered stories began to snowball, setting tongues wagging among the tech elite and venture capital circles. Meanwhile, Charlotte stayed perfectly composed whenever she and Ethan had to appear together in public. Her gracious smile never faltered, but her eyes never met his. He tried to woo her back, showering her with extravagant gifts and bouquets of white roses. She refused them all. Friends and socialites noticed the subtle strain, but were too polite or too intimidated to ask questions outright. Just when Ethan thought the worst had passed, Charlotte's quiet strategy began to unravel everything he had so carefully built. He didn't see it coming, but the seeds of her revenge were sprouting fast, and they would bear fruit far more bitter than anything he could imagine. He felt the pressure closing in. Investors who once fought to throw money at him suddenly hesitated. Bankers who used to grant him generous extensions started demanding clearer terms. Even his father, Lawrence Montgomery, requested an urgent sit-down to address the rumors swirling through boardrooms and gala dinners alike. The day Lawrence summoned him to the Montgomery Tower boardroom, Ethan braced himself for a reckoning. His father was formidable, a seasoned businessman in his late 60s who valued the Montgomery name above all else. In Lawrence's office, oak paneling and stately antique furniture cast an air of authority over every word spoken. "What's this nonsense I'm hearing about your smart city project falling behind schedule?" Lawrence barked, his voice sharp. And this talk about you dabbling in shady private loans? Ethan fought to keep his face calm. It's just gossip, Dad. I've got everything under control. Lawrence's cold stare didn't soften. Listen to me, son. I've always admired your ambition, but lately you've crossed the line. You've taken too many reckless risks. Get these rumors under control before they stain our name. Ethan forced a nod, promising he would fix it quickly. But as soon as he stepped out of Montgomery Tower, dread curled in his gut. He had no idea how to stop it. The rumors Charlotte and her allies had seeded were hitting him from every side. For every whisper he tried to quash, another one popped up. He paused at the foot of the marble steps outside the main entrance, the cold breeze slapping his face like a wake-up call he didn't want. His pulse thudded painfully in his ears as he gripped the railing, fighting the tight knot of panic closing in around his throat. He had always prided himself on being untouchable, a master at control in any crisis, but now every move seemed to make it worse. A flicker of raw fear crawled under his skin. What if Charlotte had already won, and he was just too stubborn to admit it? Even his CFO, Linda Morales, caught the tremors shaking their reputation. Ethan, we need a damage control plan, she urged in a low voice after a tense meeting. Our brand can't survive these hits forever. While Ethan battled crises at work, his personal life disintegrated. Madison, now iced out by polite society and ignored by Ethan in public, spiraled into panic. She peppered him with endless calls and angry messages, demanding he leave Charlotte and make their affair official once and for all. But Ethan knew too well. Divorcing Charlotte abruptly, especially with her family's influence, would be a public relations disaster and a legal minefield. If I push for a divorce now, he thought grimly, I could lose half of everything I've built. Maybe more if she proves adultery. To make matters worse, Madison started dropping veiled threats that she'd expose everything if he didn't give in to her demands. After one vicious shouting match in her condo, Ethan stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Only then did it dawn on him that he'd trapped himself with a desperate woman who had nothing left to lose. Meanwhile, from the quiet comfort of her mother's house, Charlotte watched him unravel, carefully tugging at every thread through her loyal network. She fed the right people the right whispers, never too obvious, never traced back to her directly. Charlotte quietly began meeting with real estate brokers and top-tier attorneys, exploring every legal avenue to isolate Ethan financially. For every small step Ethan took to regain control, Charlotte ensured a subtle push knocked him 2 steps back. Yet revenge didn't consume her entirely. She never missed a single prenatal checkup, devoting herself to her baby's health above all else. She practiced meditation, worked with a trainer who specialized in prenatal fitness, and consulted nutritionists to give her child the strongest start possible. In a strange way, the chaos in her marriage only sharpened her resolve to build a better life for her baby, one untouched by lies. Meanwhile, the strain between Ethan, Madison, and the mounting financial pressure were colliding fast, about to split their perfect facade wide open, and Charlotte was ready to watch it happen. Amid the brewing chaos, one date loomed large on the city's social calendar: the annual Montgomery Foundation Gala. It was always an extravagant night of glamour, where Silicon Valley's wealthiest gathered to flaunt their generosity. This year, though, it felt more like a live grenade waiting to detonate. Ethan had no choice but to attend. His presence was vital to calm jittery investors and donors. Technically, Charlotte was still the evening's hostess, but she made it clear she wouldn't be arriving on his arm. Instead, she agreed to appear separately, for decorum only. When the big night arrived, the grand ballroom at the Fairmont Hotel glittered with crystal chandeliers and towering floral displays. Hundreds of guests glided through the room in couture gowns and tailored tuxedos, sipping champagne and trading hushed gossip about the Montgomerys' rumored scandal. At the center stood Ethan, polished in a midnight blue tux, wearing a strained but practiced smile. Then Charlotte entered, regal in a floor-length emerald gown that beautifully embraced her growing baby bump. Heads turned instantly. She greeted everyone with warmth, her posture radiating quiet power. Ethan couldn't stop the sting of admiration that cut through his guilt. Charlotte's poise made him painfully aware of how deeply he had failed her. To many guests' shock, Madison made her own dramatic entrance, brazen in a fiery red dress that clung to every curve. She didn't bother keeping her distance from Ethan, hovering nearby whenever she could. The tension between the three of them clung to the air like static, and the ballroom buzzed as camera flashes captured the wordless war playing out under crystal chandeliers. Midway through the evening, Charlotte stepped onto the stage beside the foundation's board members to deliver a short speech. She spoke sincerely about the charity's mission, funding scholarships for underserved youth, and closed with a pointed message about trust and integrity. Her final line, offered to the sea of glittering donors, dripped with hidden meaning. It's in our darkest moments that true loyalty reveals itself. May we all cherish and honor that bond. Moments later, Madison cornered Ethan near the lavish seafood bar, her voice low and venomous. "What am I doing here alone?" she snapped, her eyes blazing with frustration. "You promised you'd stand by me, and now you're here playing the devoted husband while everyone whispers about us." Madison hissed, her voice just loud enough to draw startled glances from nearby guests. Ethan tried to keep his expression calm. "Madison, not here. Now isn't the time. We'll talk later, okay?" But Madison wouldn't be brushed aside. She pushed closer, her frustration boiling over in front of a circle of horrified socialites. Her voice rose, reckless and sharp. "Don't you dare treat me like your dirty secret, Ethan. You're the one who came after me. You think you can just toss me aside when you're done?" Ethan's face drained of color as heads turned, stunned donors, business partners, and a few lurking photographers snapping the heated exchange. This public humiliation was his worst nightmare come true. Across the glittering ballroom, Charlotte watched the chaos unfold with a quiet, vicious satisfaction. The carefully laid trap was working better than she could have hoped. Panicking, Ethan grabbed Madison's arm, trying to guide her away from the curious crowd, but it was far too late. The damage was done. Everyone had seen enough to know the affair rumors weren't idle gossip. They were painfully real. As tension spiked, the Montgomery Foundation gala twisted from an elegant fundraiser into a full-blown scandal, centered on three people: the powerful husband, his dignified, pregnant wife, and the best friend who had just shattered what was left of their respectable facade. In the days that followed, tabloids had a field day. Pictures of Madison's outburst and Ethan's mortified reaction were splashed across every gossip site and social feed, paired with lurid headlines predicting the implosion of the Montgomery marriage. Some outlets even hinted at Ethan's mounting business troubles and Madison's quiet money problems. Ethan's phone rang non-stop, journalists clamoring for statements, worried investors demanding explanations, and family members seething with embarrassment. His father, Lawrence Montgomery, was livid when he finally got him on the line. "How could you let this circus happen?" Lawrence roared. "You've dragged our name through the mud after decades of building it up. Fix this, Ethan, or I swear I will." Behind the scenes, Charlotte calmly poured more fuel on the blaze. Grace, her trusted PR strategist, arranged an exclusive leak to a prominent society columnist, exposing that Charlotte hadn't received the emotional or financial support any expectant mother should have. The piece laid out Ethan's reckless spending and lavish affairs, hinting at neglected charitable pledges and shady money management. Public opinion quickly shifted in Charlotte's favor. Online forums buzzed with sympathy for the wronged wife, now carrying Ethan's heir. Women's advocacy groups quietly highlighted her story, how she faced betrayal, a complicated pregnancy, and relentless public scrutiny with grace and quiet strength. Charlotte never gave an official statement. Her silence only made the narrative more compelling. Meanwhile, the financial fallout grew worse by the day. Banks began reviewing their loans to Montgomery Innovations, raising red flags on outstanding debts. Smaller investors threatened to pull out altogether. Linda Morales, the CFO, worked around the clock to salvage fragile deals, but each morning brought a fresh scandal splashed across the headlines. The once rock-solid empire teetered closer to collapse. Backed into a corner, Ethan scrambled to regain control. He called for a press conference to calm shareholders and reassure the board. But the morning of the event, an explosive exposé broke. A confidential spreadsheet, laying bare Montgomery Innovations' shaky cash flow, leaked to every major business outlet. It showed soaring interest payments, hidden liabilities, and margins so thin they might vanish overnight. Ethan had no clue where the leak came from, but Charlotte did. Richard Langford had quietly secured the documents through a trusted contact inside Ethan's own finance department. Someone fed up with his arrogance and willing to help Charlotte quietly tip the scales. Overnight, the revelation made it nearly impossible for Ethan to downplay the crisis. As if on cue, Madison faced her own public reckoning. Luxury boutiques revoked her open credit lines, citing the cloud of negative press. Socialites who once invited her to every brunch and launch party now ghosted her completely, unwilling to be linked with the woman branded as a homewrecker and an opportunist. That rumor of Madison siphoning money meant for charity was a well-placed twist from Charlotte's network. Now isolated and short on cash, Madison clung desperately to Ethan, demanding he fix everything. But Ethan could barely keep himself together as his fortress buckled under scandal and spiraling debt. From her mother's calm townhouse, Charlotte watched the chaos with unflinching resolve. A small ache lingered for the man she had once adored, but her anger and commitment to justice easily drowned any pity. If Ethan and Madison thought she would crumble, they had miscalculated her entirely. She would see this through, no matter how brutal the endgame became. With the pressure choking him from every angle, Ethan finally snapped. One night, he let himself into the penthouse using a spare key he had secretly kept. He found Charlotte alone in the living room and cornered her, desperation etched into every line of his face. Charlotte wasn't afraid, but she was deeply annoyed. She had hoped to avoid an unplanned showdown like this. "What the hell have you been doing?" Ethan barked, his eyes blazing. "I know you're the one behind these leaks, these rumors. Why are you trying to destroy everything we built?" Charlotte stayed perfectly composed, standing by the tall window overlooking the glittering Palo Alto skyline. She crossed her arms, her pregnancy obvious beneath a loose satin robe. "You destroyed our marriage the second you betrayed me with Madison," she said icily. "I'm simply making sure you face the consequences. You don't get to walk over me and expect no fallout." Ethan's frustration cracked through his calm mask. "You're risking our child's future," he snapped. "If I go down, you go down too." Charlotte's expression turned to stone. "Wrong. My inheritance and assets are protected by my family trust. You, on the other hand, are drowning in debt, reckless spending, and scandal. The baby will be fine, Ethan. I'll make sure of that." Her words cut deeper than any rumor ever could. Ethan felt it in his bones. The empire he had built at breakneck speed was tipping over the edge, and Charlotte held all the power now. A flicker of raw desperation crossed his face. "Then what do you want?" he asked, his voice quieter, ragged at the edges. Charlotte regarded him with a calm that only sharpened the blow. "An apology, for starters. A real one. Not just for me, but for our child. A promise you won't twist the story to make yourself look good. And you will cut Madison out of your life completely, if you want even a shred of a chance at fixing this." Ethan exhaled, fury and regret churning in his chest. Before he could respond, the doorbell rang. One of Charlotte's security staff announced Richard Langford had arrived. When Richard stepped inside, he greeted Ethan with a curt nod, then turned to Charlotte. "I brought the revised documents as requested," he said evenly. Ethan's pulse hammered. Documents. He knew instantly. Divorce papers. His stomach clenched as reality slammed into him. If Charlotte served them now, with his reputation in tatters and his finances teetering, the settlement could ruin him outright. Without a word, Charlotte took the folder from Richard and laid it neatly on the table, right where Ethan couldn't ignore it. "We can talk about this tomorrow, Ethan." Charlotte's voice was calm but final. "For now, I'd like you to leave." He lingered, wanting to protest, wanting to say something that might undo everything, but the words caught in his throat. With a frustrated exhale, he turned and strode to the door. Just before stepping out, he glanced back at her, his eyes dark with regret. "I'm sorry," he murmured, so softly it barely reached her. Then he was gone, leaving Charlotte in the hushed quiet of the penthouse. She closed her eyes, letting the weight of her choice settle over her shoulders. The confrontation had rattled her more than she cared to admit. It was never easy watching the father of her unborn child unravel piece by piece. But she reminded herself of his betrayal, and the vow she'd whispered to herself so many nights ago. Never let them think you are weak. Outside, the city lights glittered indifferently. Inside, a marriage lay in ruins, and the final blow hadn't even landed yet. Madison Price paced anxiously in her overpriced condo, checking her phone every few seconds. She had left dozens of voicemails for Ethan over the last few days, but he hadn't answered a single one. Her credit cards were maxed out, eviction threats piled on her coffee table, and the once glamorous decor of her apartment now felt like a mocking monument to the fake socialite life she could no longer maintain. A sharp knock jolted her out of her frantic spiral. She practically sprinted to the door, praying it might be Ethan. But when she opened it, she found Fiona, one of the last people she wanted to see. Fiona's frosty expression made Madison's stomach drop. "Fiona? What are you doing here?" Madison asked, stepping aside reluctantly. Fiona walked in without hesitation. "I'm here to collect a few things for Charlotte. She told me you still have some old keepsakes of hers from years ago." Madison's confusion flickered into dread. "She couldn't text me herself?" Fiona shrugged, her tone clipped. "I wouldn't know. Maybe she wanted you to get the message. You're no longer welcome in her life." She let that sink in, then added, her stare sharp as glass, "And I wanted to see for myself if the rumors were true. That you're broke, that Ethan cut you off." Madison's cheeks flamed red. "Get out, Fiona. This has nothing to do with you." Fiona folded her arms calmly. "I was Charlotte's friend long before you ever wormed your way into her trust. I'm not leaving until I have what I came for." Cornered, Madison gestured bitterly at a small box shoved into the hall closet. "Fine. Take whatever's Charlotte's, but tell her." Her voice cracked as she tried to salvage her dignity. "Tell her. I never meant for this to happen. I was lonely. It just spiraled out of control." Madison stammered, her eyes shimmering with tears. Fiona let out a cold laugh. "And you thought sleeping with her husband was the answer?" She grabbed the small box from the closet and headed for the door. "You should be ashamed. We all trusted you when you pretended to care about Charlotte." Madison's lip quivered, her voice cracking. "I didn't plan it. I really thought Ethan loved me, but now he's gone too. Please, Fiona, can't you at least tell Charlotte I'm sorry? I have no one left." Fiona paused at the doorway, her eyes like steel. "You made your bed. Now lie in it. Charlotte owes you nothing. You destroyed her marriage and made a fool of yourself. You're lucky she hasn't ruined you completely." Without waiting for a reply, Fiona left, leaving Madison frozen in the middle of her crumbling apartment, trembling and utterly alone. The message was clear. Her last connections to Charlotte's world were gone for good. She sank onto her couch, hugging a cushion to her chest as sobs shook her shoulders. She had thought Ethan would protect her. Now she realized she had been nothing but a liability, cast aside the moment she became too costly. She buried her face against the fabric, muffling a broken wail. Her mind clawed through memories of sleepovers with Charlotte, whispered secrets, shared dreams, before greed turned her heart ugly. If only she could turn back time. If only she'd said no that first night Ethan came to her, whispering temptations she now wished she'd never believed. The emptiness pressed so hard on her ribs it hurt to breathe. Was it worth it? She wondered bitterly, replaying the lies and stolen moments that had shattered so many lives. In the cold silence of that cheap, overpriced condo, Madison finally accepted the truth. Once Charlotte Harris decided you were her enemy, escape was a fantasy. Meanwhile, Ethan's downfall gathered speed. Banks called in massive loans, demanding repayment in full. His flagship smart city project stalled when funding dried up, and buyers began pulling their deposits in droves. Investors in Montgomery Innovations' public branches demanded his resignation to save what was left of their portfolios. Even his father, Lawrence Montgomery, threatened to sever ties entirely if Ethan didn't step aside to salvage the family name. Through it all, Charlotte stayed focused, steadily working with Richard Langford to finalize every detail of her legal plan. She never missed a prenatal checkup, determined to shield her child from the chaos swirling outside her mother's peaceful home. Oddly enough, the storm cleared her mind like fresh air after a long winter. She saw everything for what it was and exactly what needed to come next. Then came the day she served Ethan with the paperwork. A precisely drafted separation agreement outlining strict terms to protect her and the baby. Tucked inside was a carefully worded clause granting her full custody if Ethan failed to prove financial stability and emotional readiness to be a father. Another clause in the separation agreement demanded that Ethan surrender specific business assets if he defaulted on spousal or child support. Now he sat alone in his half-empty corner office, the papers spread across his mahogany desk. His hands trembled slightly as he flipped through the pages, shaking his head in disbelief. "You want everything," he murmured under his breath. "My God, Charlotte." She stood across from him, posture straight and dignified, despite the final weeks of her pregnancy. "You wanted this the moment you chose Madison over our family," she said softly but firmly. "I'm leaving you enough to rebuild, just not at my expense or our child's." Resigned, Ethan picked up the pen and signed. Each stroke felt like carving away the last scraps of his pride. The father he'd spent his life trying to impress now threatened to cut him out of Montgomery Innovations entirely. His mistress had become an anchor dragging him down, and the only person who'd ever truly stood by him, Charlotte, was now the one systematically dismantling the empire he'd built on ego and deceit. When the last signature was done, Charlotte turned to leave, a calm, almost serene smile touching her lips. She had her closure at last. It felt triumphant, yet undeniably bittersweet. Days later, Ethan's resignation from Montgomery Innovations was announced in a sterile press release. He retreated to a secluded villa in Napa Valley, rarely seen again among the tech elite. Madison, now broke and blacklisted, tried calling him countless times. He ignored every message, unwilling to face the living proof of his downfall. A month later, Charlotte gave birth to a healthy baby boy, Alexander Harris Montgomery. The press buzzed with photos of her cradling the newborn, flanked by Helen and a few loyal friends. Headlines crowned her as the woman who faced down a cheating billionaire, and won. Ethan sent a bouquet of white lilies with a handwritten note. "For our son, I'm sorry." Charlotte set the flowers aside, quietly amused at the irony. She would never stand between Alexander and his father, but she would make sure her son grew up knowing exactly what loyalty, betrayal, and accountability meant. In the end, Ethan and Madison lost everything that truly mattered: reputation, wealth, and any shred of genuine love. Charlotte emerged from the storm stronger than ever, carving out a future for herself and her child that no scandal could tarnish. Her transformation, from trusting wife to fierce protector, proved one enduring truth. In a world where loyalty is traded for power, never underestimate the resolve of a woman wronged. Even after the final signatures and polite headlines faded, the echoes of Ethan's betrayal rippled through Silicon Valley's high circles. Charlotte's phone pinged with carefully worded messages from so-called friends testing the limits of her forgiveness. She responded with polite courtesy, but deep down, she knew she would never truly forget what it felt like to be betrayed. And she would never let anyone forget what she did in response. Yet Charlotte resolved never to let bitterness define her. She had new priorities now, chief among them, baby Alexander. Late autumn leaves drifted across the penthouse balcony where Charlotte often stood, gently rocking her infant son to sleep. Some nights, she let herself imagine how different life could have been if Ethan had remained faithful. A family unbroken, a child born into love instead of scandal. But those thoughts never lingered long. The past couldn't be undone. Instead, she poured her heart into building a safe, loving world for Alexander, one untouched by his father's mistakes. Despite the pain between them, Charlotte agreed to a limited visitation schedule. Driven by guilt and a flicker of paternal instinct, Ethan made the effort to see his son at least once a month, arriving in a discreet black SUV instead of the flashy cars he used to flaunt. He was no longer the commanding figure who once dominated every boardroom. His designer suits hung looser on a frame hollowed out by disgrace and regret. At first, Charlotte watched each visit like a sentinel, guarded, protective. But gradually she saw glimpses of genuine tenderness in the way Ethan cradled Alexander, rocking him gently, whispering nonsense words that made the baby giggle. Their relationship remained strained, yet there was an unspoken acceptance. Ethan had paid dearly for his betrayal, and Charlotte had fought fiercely for her self-respect. They were no longer husband and wife, just two flawed people linked forever by the tiny boy cooing between them. Any hope for reconciliation stayed buried where it belonged. No apology, however sincere, could ever bridge the distance now carved between them. Meanwhile, rumors drifted through Silicon Valley about Madison. Some said she'd packed up her few remaining belongings in the dead of night to dodge relentless creditors. She retreated to a shabby rental far outside the city, uninvited, unwanted by the social circles she once schemed to conquer. Alone, she wrestled with the hollow echo of a friendship she had betrayed for fleeting thrills and easy luxury. Whispers claimed she had tried to reach Ethan for help, but he never returned her calls. In contrast, Charlotte's world slowly bloomed again. She renewed her charity work, this time focusing on single mothers and women blindsided by betrayal. Her own trials had taught her how quickly life could shatter and how vital it was to have someone fighting in your corner. Under her leadership, the Montgomery Foundation expanded its outreach, transforming a scandal's ashes into real hope. One bright afternoon, Charlotte stood on her balcony with Alexander giggling in her arms. For a moment, the city faded away, leaving only his tiny heartbeat and his bright, innocent eyes that promised a future far removed from lies and heartbreak. Yet beneath her calm smile, a single fragile fear lingered. The fear that one day, Alexander would grow old enough to learn how broken things once were. She prayed silently he would see not the pain but the strength that rose from it. She pressed a soft kiss to his forehead, reminding herself, real love wasn't a fairy tale spun from illusions. It was the quiet strength that survives even the deepest betrayal. It was about resilience, empathy, and standing tall for those who depend on you, no matter what storms rage outside. In that quiet moment on the balcony, Charlotte Harris understood she hadn't just survived her ordeal. She had rewritten her life's story from the ashes. It was never truly about the cheating billionaire or the treacherous best friend. It was about a woman who refused to be broken, who chose to shape a new future for herself and her son. One built on integrity, resolve, and the unshakable belief that sometimes losing everything is the first step toward discovering who you're meant to be. No matter how high we rise or how untouchable we think we are, life has a way of humbling us. Ethan Montgomery learned that lesson the hardest way possible, his betrayal unraveling into ruin, dragging Madison Price down with him. Yet Charlotte emerged from the storm stronger than ever, a living testament that a determined heart can bend fate to its will, even when the odds seem impossible. So my wonderful friends, here we are, at the end of Charlotte's stormy but inspiring journey. If you're still with me right now, I know this story must have touched a soft corner of your heart, just like it did mine while sharing it with you. What can we carry from her scars and triumphs into our own daily lives? Maybe it's this: life will test our faith in people. It will shake our sense of security. And sometimes the ones we trust most can shatter us the deepest. But as the Stoics remind us, what stands in the way becomes the way. Charlotte didn't let betrayal define her. She turned it into fuel to build a better, kinder life for her son and herself. Each of us faces storms that feel unfair or unbearable. Sometimes we think, if only things had been different. But Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Charlotte embodied this truth. She didn't control Ethan's lies or Madison's envy, but she fiercely guarded her spirit and her child's future. So if tonight you're holding on to anger, or heartbreak, or a regret that won't let you sleep, pause, breathe, and ask yourself, how can I shape this pain into something wiser, softer, and more powerful than I was yesterday? You and I, we can't undo what broke us, but we can choose who we become because of it. That, my dear friends, is real power. If Charlotte's story gave you even a sliver of hope or courage, please don't leave it here. Like this video, share it with someone who needs it, and hit that subscribe button. Every click helps us keep telling raw human stories like this, stories that remind us we're not alone in the storms. Thank you for being here with me tonight. Remember, karma rarely forgets, and neither should you. Stay strong, stay kind, and I'll see you in the next story. What happens when a man who owns everything faces losing the one thing he can't buy? Alexander Grayson, a titan of construction empires built on concrete and ruthless ambition, believed his pregnant wife was just another exquisite ornament in his private museum. When she finally found the courage to leave, he laughed. Her tears, to him, were just a passing storm, a hormonal outburst he could silence with a credit card and a dismissive smirk. He watched from his penthouse window as she vanished from his world, a lone figure on the rain-slicked sidewalk, until his laughter froze, turning cold in his veins. When a car pulled up to the curb, it wasn't a cab. It wasn't a friend. The door swung open, and the man who stepped out to greet her was the one ghost from Alexander's past he'd prayed never to face again. The echo of his own laugh bounced off the penthouse's floor-to-ceiling glass, sharp and cruel like the city skyline beyond. It mocked Alexander Grayson, whose fortune was dissected daily in business magazines, and yet he threw back his head and laughed again, a sound with no warmth, a thunderclap of dominance filling the sleek, cold living room where Serena stood, a small, hastily stuffed leather duffel bag at her feet. Her hand rested protectively on the soft curve of her belly, a 6-month truth of a love that had soured into duty. Tears poured down her cheeks, silent and searing, each drop a tiny revolt against the man she had once worshipped. "You're leaving me?" Alexander managed at last, dabbing a tear of amusement from his eye. He gestured grandly at the room, at the original Warhol on the wall, the bespoke Steinway grand piano in the corner, and the sweeping view of Lake Michigan beyond. "You're leaving all this? For what? A sudden burst of feminine hysteria?" Serena flinched, but her voice, when it rose, was steadier than she felt. "I'm leaving you, Alexander. I'm leaving this mausoleum. I can't raise a child in this prison." He scoffed, striding closer. Tall, imposing, clad in a Brioni suit that cost more than her father's entire pickup truck. He stopped inches away, close enough for her to smell the sharp, peaty scent of his scotch. "I gave you the world, Serena. Don't be foolish. You're pregnant. Your hormones are making you irrational." He reached to touch her belly, a possessive gesture she had grown to loathe. He didn't see a child, a life they'd made. He saw an heir. Another Grayson. Another asset. She slapped his hand away. The sound was shockingly loud in the cavernous room. Alexander's smile tightened, the humor draining away, replaced by a glacial fury. "Don't you dare," he whispered, his voice dangerously low. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice cracking but steady at the core. "I'm not some vase you put on a pedestal. I'm not a broodmare for your empire. I'm a person, and this baby deserves a father who sees them as a person, not as another corporate share." "And where will you go?" he sneered, confidence swelling back into his voice. But beneath the sneer, a flicker of dread coiled in his gut, an unspoken terror that for the first time she might mean it. He crushed the thought, smothering it under scorn. "Back to your tiny loft in Lincoln Park? Back to your little circle of starving artists who think they're successful if they sell one canvas for rent money? How long before you crawl back, Serena? A week? 2? He truly believed it. He had plucked her from obscurity, a gifted but unknown art curator, and wrapped her in a world of obscene wealth. He'd cleared her father's debts, paid for her sister's graduate degree, draped her in rare stones. In his mind, he hadn't married her. He'd purchased her loyalty. Gratitude was her native tongue, or so he believed. "That's the difference between you and me, Alexander," she said, lifting her bag. "You think everything has a price tag, my dignity, my happiness, my child's future. But you're wrong. Some things are not for sale." She turned toward the private elevator that opened straight into their condo. Each step was an anchor breaking loose, a final, bitter slice of freedom. Alexander didn't move. He just stood there with that smug, untouchable smirk carved into his face. Inside, a tightness clenched in his chest, a wordless fear that for the first time he couldn't buy her back. But his pride forced him still, frozen in the pose of a man who never lost. Let her play this game. She'd be back before Sunday night, crying and begging to be the polished, silent wife he required. He poured himself another scotch, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal tumbler. This was nothing, a mild disturbance in the perfect screenplay of his existence. He raised his glass in a mocking salute just as the sleek elevator doors slid shut, locking her out. "Fly away, my little bird," he murmured to the echoing room. "Enjoy your tiny taste of freedom." He chuckled to himself, took a deep drink, and drifted to the floor-to-ceiling windows, curious to watch the pitiful next act of her rebellion unfold. He expected to see her fumbling for a cab on the street below. A soaked, defeated silhouette, swallowed whole by a city she could never tame on her own. He thought this show was about to turn deliciously pathetic, and he had the best seat in the house. Alexander stood by the window, a king atop his concrete fortress. The dizzying height usually fed his sense of invincibility, but tonight it served only as a balcony for his private, malicious spectacle. He stared at the building's grand marble portico, waiting for Serena to step out. The rain had intensified, coating the Chicago asphalt until it glowed like polished obsidian beneath the street lamps. A fitting stage, he mused with a cruel smirk. A crying sky for his crying, foolish wife. Finally, the doorman in his crisp military-style uniform pushed open the heavy glass door. Serena stepped out, clutching her thin coat tightly around her shoulders. From this height, she looked so small, so breakable, exactly as Alexander had pictured. She paused at the top step, glancing left and right, the weight of the duffel bag tugging at her arm. Alexander swirled his scotch, the ice rattling against the crystal. Here it comes, he thought, the frantic search for her phone. The hopeless wave for a taxi in the pounding rain, the slow, bitter realization that she was utterly alone. He leaned forward slightly, savoring the moment like fine whiskey, except there was no fumbling. Serena just stood there, waiting. And then it happened. A car turned the corner and coasted to a stop right in front of the marble portico. Alexander's eyebrows lifted. It wasn't a yellow cab. It wasn't a rideshare Prius. It was a car that belonged in front of this building. This shrine of privilege. A deep midnight blue beauty, polished to a mirror shine that bent the streetlights into rivers of liquid gold. Alexander narrowed his eyes. Even from 30 stories up, he knew those lines. The commanding grille, the unmistakable spirit of ecstasy leading the charge. A Rolls-Royce. Not just any Rolls-Royce, a Cullinan. The brand's crowning beast of off-road luxury, an SUV worth more than some family's lifetime earnings. A fortress of quiet power on 4 wheels. A sharp splinter of annoyance cut through Alexander's amusement. Had one of her vapid trust fund artist friends come crawling back to rescue her? Had she really kept a crumb of the life he had so generously given? The doorman, who never bowed to anyone but the tower's billionaire owners, hurried forward to open the back passenger door before the driver even moved. He lifted a large black umbrella, shielding the arriving guest from the rain. Alexander pressed closer to the glass, his drink forgotten in his grip. Who the hell is this? It wasn't a woman. A man stepped out of the Cullinan. Older, late 60s maybe, his hair a sleek silver that seemed impervious to the weather. He wore a flawlessly tailored charcoal overcoat and carried himself with a calm authority that needed no showmanship. No hurry, no pretense. He simply turned and offered his hand to Serena. Serena, who had stood frozen for what felt like forever, suddenly softened. She slipped her hand into his, her whole body folding into a genuine luminous smile, a smile Alexander hadn't seen aimed at him in years. The man murmured something, and she nodded, her shoulders dropping, her posture transforming from a cornered fugitive into someone safe, certain, home. He gently took her duffel bag with his free hand and guided her into the warm, waiting interior of the Rolls-Royce. Alexander's heart slammed against his ribs. There was something disturbingly familiar about the man's silhouette, the set of his shoulders, the calm precision of his movements. A cold dread, foreign and suffocating, coiled up Alexander's spine. It couldn't be. It was impossible. The man closed the door after Serena gave a brief, dismissive nod to the doorman, then circled calmly to the other side of the car. But before he slid in, he paused. He tilted his chin upward, eyes lifting past the tiers of granite and glass, straight toward the penthouse window. Straight at Alexander. The distance was staggering. The rain distorted the city into a watery blur, but there was no mistaking him. The streetlights caught his face for one brutal heartbeat. The strong jawline, softened only slightly by age, but still firm. Those sharp, discerning eyes that had once looked at Alexander with genuine pride, then with unspeakable betrayal. The laugh caught in Alexander Grayson's throat and died there. The glass slipped from his limp fingers, crashing onto the marble and spraying expensive scotch across his polished shoes. He stumbled backward from the window, lungs clawing for air. It was Charles Whitcomb, his mentor, his former partner, the man he had crushed, humiliated, and left for dead 10 years ago to seize full control of their joint empire. The man everyone assumed was living out his final days broke and irrelevant. Charles Whitcomb, looking anything but broken, radiating power, and he was driving away with Alexander's pregnant wife. All the smugness, the ironclad certainty, gone in an instant. What flooded in was raw, instinctive terror. This wasn't hormonal foolishness. This wasn't a domestic squabble. This was a battle cry. A war Alexander thought he'd buried a decade ago, and the ghost he had made was now stealing his future. The shards of glass crunched under his leather sole as he stumbled back, mind churning with disbelief and volcanic rage. Charles. It couldn't be Charles. Charles was an anecdote, a cautionary fable he fed to junior executives about the fatal weakness of sentiment in cutthroat business. He was supposed to be a ghost, sealed under Alexander's mountain of profit and power. He lurched to his desk and slammed his palm onto the intercom. "Marcus, get in here, now." His voice tore out of him, ragged and stripped of its usual iron control. Marcus Thorne, his COO and the closest thing Alexander ever had to a real friend, burst in moments later, face tight with alarm. "Alexander, what happened? I heard something break." "He was here," Alexander breathed, raking a hand through his perfectly combed hair, shoving it out of place for the first time in years. "Whitcomb, he was here." Marcus frowned, confusion creasing his forehead. "Charles Whitcomb? Here? In the building?" "Outside," Alexander thundered, jabbing a trembling finger at the rain-smeared window. "He just drove off with Serena. In a Cullinan, Marcus, a goddamn Rolls-Royce Cullinan." Marcus's mask of boardroom calm finally cracked. "What, that's impossible. Last I heard, Charles was holed up in a rented cabin near Lake Geneva, practically bankrupt." "That's exactly what he wanted us to think," Alexander snarled, mind tearing through a decade's worth of carefully buried memories. Betrayal flooded back, so vivid it may as well have been yesterday. Flashback. 10 years ago, the firm was called Grayson and Whitcomb Developments. Charles, then a powerhouse in Chicago real estate, pushing 60, had taken a raw, ferociously ambitious Alexander Grayson under his wing. Alexander was brilliant, ravenous, and utterly merciless, traits Charles mistook for mere youthful drive. Charles was the visionary, the reputation, the name that could seal million-dollar deals with a handshake. Alexander was the strategist, the numbers savant who could wring profit from bare dirt. Their crowning jewel was to be the Riverfront Promenade, a pioneering mixed-use revival on a decaying stretch of the Chicago River. It was Charles's dream, years nurturing city permits, building relationships, sketching blueprints on napkins. Alexander's job was to structure the financing, an intricate puzzle only he could solve. The centerpiece was a syndicate of Japanese investors, old-guard traditionalists who trusted Charles implicitly. Charles brought Alexander into the inner circle, parading him as his protégé, his heir apparent. "Alexander has a mind like a steel trap," Charles would say, clapping him on the back. "He's the future of this company." Alexander soaked it all in. Charles's contacts, his negotiation style, and his biggest blind spot, unwavering trust. And in rare, quiet hours, even Alexander felt the heavy warmth of being believed in, an ache of gratitude he smothered under ambition. The deal was days from closing. The Japanese investors were boarding planes for Chicago, final contracts in hand. That's when Alexander struck. He had spent months quietly building a separate shell company, weaving an invisible web of perfectly legal loopholes. He tweaked the final financing agreements, inserting clauses he knew Charles, ever the big-picture man, wouldn't bother to scrutinize. These lines made critical loan guarantees depend not on Grayson and Whitcomb, but on Charles's personal fortune. At the same time, Alexander flew to Tokyo on a preliminary courtesy visit. He met privately with the younger faction of the board, the ambitious sons eager to modernize their father's old ways. He never smeared Charles outright. He was subtler than that. He planted doubt like weeds. He talked about Charles's outmoded style, hinted at stubbornness, whispered carefully about emerging health concerns. He cast himself as the steady, forward-thinking steward the project deserved. For one trembling moment on the flight home, a sliver of guilt cut through him. Charles's face flickered behind his eyelids, proud and trusting. But by the time the wheels touched down, he had buried it so deep that even he could pretend it never existed. The day the investors landed in Chicago, Charles strolled into the glass conference room, grinning ear to ear, ready to watch his legacy take flight. The Japanese investors were unfailingly polite, but their eyes were cold. Their lead negotiator, Mr. Tanaka Jr., pointed to the revised clauses. He tapped the page detailing a market volatility rider that Alexander had slipped in, one that could be activated by the faintest market tremor, shifting enormous liability onto the personal guarantor. "We cannot proceed with your firm under these conditions," Tanaka Jr. said flatly. "It is too great a risk to our capital." Charles was blindsided, bewildered. He turned to Alexander, searching his face for support, for an explanation. Alexander rose smoothly to his feet. "Gentlemen," he declared, his voice dripping with polished, fraudulent confidence, "I fully understand your concerns. That's why my new entity, Grayson Holdings, is prepared to purchase the project rights outright and assume the full financial obligation, backed by a stronger, diversified funding structure." For the previous 48 hours, he had been scrambling behind the scenes, locking down high-risk, high-interest capital from a predatory hedge fund, using the impending Japanese investment as bait. Inside, a sick twist of shame coiled under his ribs as he spoke. He glimpsed Charles's stunned face, like a father betrayed at his own table, and for half a heartbeat, part of him wanted to stop, to confess. But then the iron certainty surged back. Mercy was weakness, and he was done being weak. The room went dead silent. Charles gaped at Alexander, the color draining from his face as the scale of the betrayal dawned on him in crushing detail. Alexander hadn't just restructured a contract, he had orchestrated a hostile takeover. Seeing an exit from Charles's perceived risk, the Japanese board agreed. The deal closed under Grayson Holdings. Charles was out, cut off from the very dream he had built. Worse, the groundwork he had spent years laying was tangled in legal booby traps. Alexander's new, vicious legal team accused him of fiduciary breach, launching lawsuits that would slowly bleed Charles's personal wealth dry. 6 months later, Grayson and Whitcomb Developments was no more. Charles Whitcomb, the man once revered for closing deals on a handshake alone, was shattered. He lost his firm, his vision, and every dollar he had staked on trust. He sold his house, his paintings, his pride, and then he vanished. Back to present day. "He's been planning this," Alexander whispered, the truth striking him like a hammer to the chest. All this time, he wasn't hiding in ruin. He was regrouping, rebuilding. Marcus's face had gone chalk white. And Serena, how? Alexander's thoughts jumped backward. The charity galas, the silent auctions. Serena, with her unfeigned love for art, always gravitating toward the older patrons. The soft-spoken collectors who valued conversation more than spectacle. Charles. He'd been there all along. A quiet, distinguished gentleman who listened to her, who treated her like a human being instead of an ornament. The conversations, the dinners, the trust, the marriage, the baby. Charles. He'd been the silent third player in it all, feeding her quiet doubts, lending a patient, sympathetic ear, slowly and methodically setting the stage for his final act of vengeance. The realization turned Alexander's stomach. It rewrote the last several years of his life, not as a series of victories, but as one long, elegant trap. "He didn't just take my wife," Alexander growled, his voice dropping to a venomous hiss. He turned to Marcus, eyes blazing with a terrifying new purpose. "He's come for everything. He thinks he can tear down my life exactly the way I tore apart his." A cold, sharp smile ghosted across Alexander's lips. The raw fear was already crystallizing, hardening back into arrogance, then rage. "Get our entire legal arm on the line. Family division first. The best divorce sharks in Chicago, New York, wherever. I want her left with nothing. Not a single dollar. And find a private investigator. I want every detail on Charles Whitcomb's last 10 years. Where he sleeps, what he eats, who he talks to." He stalked back to the window, staring down at the rain-drenched grid of city streets. "I buried him once," he murmured. "I'll bury him again." But for the first time in his life, Alexander Grayson felt a deep, unsettling shift beneath his feet, an unsteady tremor in the foundation he'd always taken for granted. The ghost he thought he'd annihilated wasn't just alive, it was moving against him, and it had started by taking the one thing he was only now realizing he could never afford to lose. The opening strike in Alexander's counterattack was sheer brute force. Within 24 hours, he unleashed the full wrath of his legal machine. A strike team of predators from the priciest matrimonial firm in Chicago was summoned with one standing order: obliterate. They filed for divorce, citing abandonment and severe emotional cruelty. They slapped down preemptive injunctions to freeze every asset Serena might dare to claim. They drafted pages of discovery demands for every text, email, call, anything that might weaken her. The message rang out loud and clear. This would not be civil. It would be a siege, bleeding her dry mentally and financially. At the same time, the private investigator, a former NSA analyst named Colby, began his dive into Charles Whitcomb's hidden life. Alexander expected a rap sheet of flopped businesses, foreclosure notices, proof of a man clawing just to breathe. Instead, the first report came back thin as air. "It's like he vanished for 5 years," Colby reported, his voice edged with professional irritation. "No paper trail, no real estate, nothing. Then he pops back up about 5 years ago, under the radar. No credit lines, no bank accounts in his name. He's been living in a leased home in Greenwich, Connecticut, leases paid by a blind trust in Switzerland." "A blind trust," Alexander scoffed, a humorless bark of laughter. "That's a rich man's toy. Where the hell did he get the capital?" "That's the mystery," Colby admitted. "There's zero sign of significant income. He turns up at art auctions every so often, always pays with cashier's checks. He's listed as a member of a private intellectual society, mostly aging academics and retired philosophers," Colby reported, scrolling through his notes. "On paper, he's just a modest retiree with vague means, but a Rolls-Royce Cullinan and a Swiss trust? The paper trail is a lie." The lack of dirt frustrated Alexander more than a scandalous history ever could have. It meant Charles was meticulous, patient. It meant he'd been laying this trap for years, maybe longer. Then the second strike came, but not from Alexander, from Charles. And it didn't target Alexander's marriage. It struck at the pulsing heart of his corporate empire. It began with one harmless-looking press release that got picked up by an obscure finance blog. Whitcomb Strategic Advisors launches new urban renewal initiative. Alexander read it and felt a shiver crawl down his back. The phrasing was unmistakably Charles's, full of idealistic vision, community revitalization, and sustainable growth. But behind the poetry, there were hidden fangs. A cold sweat beaded at his hairline as he read the same sentence 3 times over. It wasn't just a project. This was a flag planted in territory he thought he owned forever. A piece of him wanted to laugh it off, but deeper down, something primitive curled up and hissed. Fear. The release declared that the firm had locked in a colossal round of funding from a network of patient capital investors. Family offices and ethical endowments seeking steady, long-term returns instead of risky, short-term flips. Their debut project, the Greenwich waterfront revitalization. It was bold. It was direct. It was a head-on assault on Alexander's crown jewel, Grayson Tower, an ultra-luxury skyscraper halfway built in Stamford, just miles away. Where Grayson Tower was a fortress of glass and concrete, promising exclusivity and status, Charles's project promised walkable neighborhoods, green spaces, and community gathering hubs. It was a philosophical and financial slap in the face. "He's competing with me," Alexander snarled at Marcus, pacing behind his massive mahogany desk. The stock ticker on his monitor showed Grayson Global, GGC, dipping 2 full points. "He's using my damn playbook against me." "It's worse than that," Marcus said grimly, holding out a tablet. "Look at the board of Whitcomb Strategic Advisors." Alexander snatched it and skimmed the names. His vision tunneled. On that list were 2 of the world's most revered architects, a former EPA director, and Kenji Tanaka. Not the junior he'd manipulated a decade ago, the elder Tanaka, the patriarch of the Japanese consortium, the man who had once staked his family's honor on Charles Whitcomb. The paper blurred as rage and dread tangled in his chest like barbed wire. All those late-night boasts, all the allies he thought would never turn, now they were standing behind Charles, armed to burn him down. Now he was listed as a senior strategic partner. Charles hadn't just rebuilt his world, he'd fortified it with the same allies Alexander had once stolen and betrayed. The third strike hit Alexander straight in the gut. It didn't arrive as a lawsuit or a hostile acquisition. It came in the form of a glossy Vanity Fair exclusive. He braced for a sob story, Serena as the tragic abandoned trophy wife. He was wrong. The headline, "The Curator's Comeback." It was a flattering, breathless profile of Serena, framed not as a victim, but as a woman who had rediscovered her calling. The photos were knife-sharp. Serena glowing, pregnant, serene in a sun-drenched art studio. alive in a way she never looked standing next to him. She spoke with striking grace about her passion for weaving art into public spaces, about designing places that nurtured human connection instead of polished isolation. She was officially introduced as the new Director of Aesthetic and Community Experience for the Greenwich Waterfront Revitalization. Her role wasn't ornamental. It was the heartbeat of the entire vision. She spoke of Charles Whitcomb, not as a lover, but as a mentor, a man who had rekindled her faith in creating with integrity. She uttered Alexander's name just once, with a single line that detonated like a bomb. When asked about her marriage, she paused, then said, "I lived in a very beautiful, very expensive echo chamber for a long time. I'm just grateful I can hear my own voice again." And that was it. The narrative solidified overnight. Charles, the wise elder statesman; Serena, the liberated visionary; Alexander, by calculated omission, the cold puppet master who built the echo chamber. The backlash was immediate. Nervous investors began ringing his phone off the hook. Board members demanded an emergency strategy session. The bank underwriting the Grayson Tower construction loan called for an urgent review of the project's debt covenants, spooked by the sudden, high-profile competition. Each new headline felt like a slap, but it was Serena's gentle words that cut the deepest. A part of him recoiled at the public betrayal, yet buried under the fury, a raw, unfamiliar shame bloomed. She shone in ways he never let her, and the worst truth of all was that he knew it. The pristine, unstoppable machine of Alexander's life was starting to grind and sputter. His empire wasn't merely under attack, it was being unstitched at every seam. Only now did he understand. Charles didn't want to hurt him. He wanted to dismantle him, piece by humiliating piece, until there was nothing left but the hollow echo of Alexander's own arrogance. The war shifted from dramatic strikes to a slow, suffocating siege. Charles's tactics were brutal in their restraint. No threatening calls, no angry letters, just a quiet, relentless unraveling played out in the public eye. The first to jump ship was Alexander's head of structural engineering, a savant named Dr. Alastair Finch. Finch was a man who valued legacy over bonuses. Charles didn't just tempt him with more money, he offered Finch a chance to design the green, cutting-edge buildings he'd always dreamed of. Ideas Alexander had once ridiculed as cost-prohibitive fantasies. Finch's departure was a silent quake that shook the whole company. Next to fold was the marketing team. Charles, with Serena as his radiant ambassador, was dominating the PR war without breaking a sweat. Their project became the darling of urban design forums, celebrated for its human-centered concept. Meanwhile, Grayson Tower, once the embodiment of aspirational wealth, was recast in the press as an ice-cold monument to unchecked greed. The extravagant penthouses that once sold themselves were now sitting on the market, toxic by association. Inside Grayson Global, Alexander was trapped in a vicious cycle of fury and paranoia. He screamed at his team, second-guessed every decision, and trusted no one. The once coveted atmosphere of innovation curdled overnight into something poisonous. He escalated his legal siege against Serena, but the tactic backfired spectacularly. Acting on his ruthless instructions, his lawyers subpoenaed her obstetrician's records. The maneuver was so heartless that it leaked to the press within hours. The headline blared, "Billionaire demands pregnant wife's private medical files." It detonated as a PR disaster. Alexander felt like a man grasping at smoke. He'd hurl millions at a crisis, only for Charles to sidestep him with a perfectly placed relationship or a precisely timed press release. For the first time, he caught himself staring at his reflection in the black glass of his office window, wondering if he even knew how to win anymore. Every trick he once wielded like a blade dulled in his hands, as if he were swinging at shadows. Colby, his investigator, was still smashing into dead ends. "The money's legitimate, Alexander," Colby said at their latest late-night check-in, sounding uncharacteristically resigned. "After you destroyed him, Charles didn't jump into business again. He went back to academia. He won a fellowship at Oxford, spent 3 years studying economic theory and ethics, wrote a few papers on sustainable capitalism. Nobody paid much attention, but I think that's when he was building his network. And his thesis? A blueprint for revenge," Alexander muttered. "Looks like it," Colby agreed. "The funding for his new venture? It's not Wall Street money. It's old capital, European lineages, Asian dynasties. families that knew his father, people who value loyalty more than quarterly earnings. You built Grayson Global on debt and leverage. He built Whitcomb Strategic on trust. Our usual pressure tactics? They don't scare these people. They don't answer to a board. They answer to their family legacy. Alexander swallowed the sour taste in his mouth. If debt and fear didn't bend them, what did he have left? What did he have left? The hemorrhage turned literal. To stop the market from panicking over Grayson Tower, Alexander was forced to inject his own cash, buying back chunks of debt at inflated prices to soothe anxious bankers. He liquidated a huge portion of his carefully curated stock portfolio, including prized shares in blue-chip tech firms. He sold his private jet. Officially, it was cost discipline. Unofficially, everyone saw it for what it was, a white flag. One restless night, desperate to reclaim a scrap of power, he drove alone to Greenwich, Connecticut. Not to the buzzing construction site of Charles's waterfront project. To the quiet address Colby had traced as Charles's current residence. It was a large but modest stone house, tucked behind a stand of ancient oak trees. Alexander parked across the street, killed the engine, and sat there in the darkness. Warm light spilled from the windows, wrapping the house in an inviting glow that mocked him. He could see figures moving inside, shadows crossing one another like an unspoken domestic dance. A lamp flickered to life in an upstairs room. The window with the small balcony caught his eye first. Serena stepped out into the cool night air. She was unmistakably, beautifully pregnant now. Her silhouette outlined clearly against the warm interior light. She wore a simple white shawl and cradled a mug of what looked like tea. She wasn't crying. She wasn't pacing or fretting. She was calm. She leaned gently against the railing, tilting her face up to the stars. A moment later, Charles joined her. He didn't touch her like a lover. Instead, he draped a heavier blanket over her shoulders, then pointed skyward, speaking softly as if naming a constellation just for her. They stood like that for a while, two figures in easy silence, a portrait of undisturbed, honest peace. It was everything Alexander had never possessed. Everything he hadn't even known how to want. Watching them cracked something inside him. The rage, the raw, driving fury, it still burned, but now it curdled with a new, more corrosive poison: envy. But beneath that envy, there pulsed a raw ache he couldn't name. An ache for warmth he'd always mocked, for softness he'd convinced himself was weakness. Seeing her like this made him feel like a starving man at a feast just beyond reach. He had torn Charles's fortune apart once. Charles had survived and built something real in its place. And now Charles was dismantling Alexander piece by piece, not just his wealth, but his entire sense of self. Who was Alexander Grayson without the jet? Without the iron grip of command? Without the trophy wife who obeyed? No one. Just a man alone in a car, watching a life he could never own. He started the engine and drove off into the night, the image of Serena and Charles under the stars seared into his brain. His hands clutched the wheel so tightly, his knuckles whitened. He wanted to tear out the feeling inside him, but found nothing left to rip free except himself. The bleeding wasn't confined to bank accounts anymore. It was inside him now, spreading through every corner of who he was. The siege was succeeding. The fortress of Alexander Grayson was rotting from within, and the downfall was speeding up. What began as setbacks snowballed into a full-scale crisis. A major supplier for Grayson Tower, rattled by whispers of insolvency, demanded payment in full, up front, for all future materials. That single move triggered a domino effect. Other contractors followed suit, tightening terms and hoarding cash. A liquidity crunch slammed into the company like a wrecking ball. Alexander was a cornered predator now. The ice-blooded strategist was gone, replaced by a snarling animal. Days vanished inside his office, blinds shut, lights dim, eyes locked on screens streaming red numbers that spelled slow death. Nights were vodka-laced marathons of paranoia and desperate calls. Marcus Thorne did his best to be the last voice of reason. He pleaded for a tactical retreat. Cut their losses, sell the troubled Grayson Tower, salvage what could be saved. Sell? Alexander roared, his face blotched crimson. Sell my monument to some bottom-feeder private equity ghoul? Never. That building has my name on it. Alexander, Marcus said softly, shoulders tense. Your name is becoming toxic. Marcus had argued, had begged really. His loyalty stretched until it finally snapped. We need to cauterize the wound before it infects the whole of Grayson Global. The argument ended with Marcus submitting his resignation. To Alexander, it was the ultimate betrayal, the last true ally abandoning the battlefield. Some hidden, brittle part of him recoiled at the finality of it. Marcus had been the last voice that reminded him who he'd once claimed to be, and now even that mirror was gone. In truth, it was self-preservation, plain and simple. Left alone, Alexander's choices grew increasingly reckless. He funneled the last of his liquid capital into a desperate, high-risk options play, wagering everything on a market swing his gut insisted was imminent. It was the kind of gamble only a man with nothing left to lose would take. And it detonated in his face. The market turned against him. The loss was a financial killing blow, vaporizing nearly a third of his remaining personal wealth in a single afternoon. He was hemorrhaging, and for once, he felt every drop. He drifted through the cavernous emptiness of his penthouse, a ghost haunting a tomb of his own making. The Warhol on the wall mocked him with its vivid colors, a jarring contrast to the stale gray fog swallowing his mind. He remembered buying it with Serena by his side, her patient voice explaining the layers of feeling beneath the brushstrokes. He hadn't cared. All he'd seen then was a price tag that only climbed higher. He closed his eyes, and for a fleeting second he heard her laughter, light and young, before it hardened into silence under his rules. The echo cut deeper than the loss on any balance sheet. Now all he saw was another asset waiting to be sold. He called a private art broker. The transaction was discreet but humiliating. The painting he once flaunted at lavish dinner parties was crated up and carried out in silence, under cover of darkness, sold for a fraction of its worth because he needed immediate cash. That night, hollowed out and trembling, he crossed a line he'd once sworn he never would. He paid Colby an outrageous sum to track down Serena's new private number. Then he called it. He didn't even know what he'd say. Threaten, apologize? Beg? A man answered. It was Charles. "She won't be speaking with you, Alexander," Charles said, his voice calm, utterly free of triumph. Just a simple, immutable truth spoken aloud. "Put her on," Alexander rasped, voice splintering at the edges. "She's my wife." "A piece of paper you keep trying to wield like a weapon," Charles cut in, smooth as a scalpel. "She's building a life now, Alexander. A life you never allowed her. She's preparing to welcome her child. The last thing she needs is the poison of your chaos." "My chaos." The word stabbed him. He spat it back. "You did this. You planned this. You turned her against me." There was a pause, a small sigh on the other end of the line. When Charles spoke again, his voice held a quiet, devastating sadness. "You still don't see it, do you?" Charles's voice was soft, like a parent explaining a hard truth to a stubborn child. "I didn't turn her against you. You did. Your cruelty, your neglect, that towering ego you mistook for strength. All I did was offer her a safe harbor when she finally chose to flee the storm. And Alexander, you were the storm." "What do you want, Charles?" Alexander whispered. The rage had drained out of him, leaving a raw, cavernous hollow. For a fleeting second, something pathetic and childlike rose in his throat. A plea to undo it all, to beg for a different ending. But he swallowed it back down with bitter pride. "Is this it? You want me broke? Homeless? My endgame?" Charles said gently. "My endgame happened the moment Serena found the courage to walk away from you. This was always about her freedom, not your ruin. But you," he sighed, a tired sound, "you can't grasp any reality that isn't a battlefield. You still believe this was done to you. You can't fathom that someone did this for her." He went on, unwavering. "She's happy, Alexander. She's at peace. And her child will be born into a world that values kindness and truth over power. That is the endgame. The rest, your debts, your crumbling tower, that's just gravity catching up to a man who built his kingdom on sand." The line went dead. Alexander stood frozen in his penthouse, the dial tone humming in his ear like an insect. On sand, the words echoed off the bare walls. He turned to the dark glass, seeing not the feared titan of commerce, but a ragged husk of a man, his hand-tailored suit hanging off him like a borrowed disguise. He pressed a palm to the cold glass, half expecting it to show him the city he'd once ruled. All he saw was his own hollow reflection, unworthy even of the skyline. He made one last gamble. It wasn't about money. It was raw, personal need. He had to see her. See them both. He would force a confrontation, something real, human, away from lawyers and quarterly reports. The next morning he called Charles's office. His voice was eerily calm. "I'm conceding," he lied. "There are things we need to settle about the divorce, about the baby. No lawyers, just you, me, and Serena. Tell me when and where." Charles paused, then reluctantly agreed. They set the meeting for 2 days later. A neutral place, a private suite at an old-world yet discreet hotel, somewhere built for quiet diplomacy and confidential agreements. Alexander ended the call and sat in silence, a strange, icy clarity settling over him like a second skin. If this was the end, he would not go down whimpering. He would look them both in the eye, make them feel the ruin they'd left behind. The hotel suite was a flawless example of luxurious neutrality. It impressed without lingering in memory. The furniture whispered wealth but revealed no soul. The paintings were elegant but bland. The thick, pale carpet swallowed every footstep, sealing the room in a hush heavy with judgment. To Alexander, it felt less like common ground and more like a softly upholstered courtroom. One final, suffocating chamber where the verdict on his life was about to be delivered. He arrived a full 30 minutes early, an old general's instinct to claim the battlefield before the enemy appeared. But the familiar jolt of control that punctuality always gave him was missing. In its place coiled a restless, gnawing dread that pushed him in circles, from the curtained window to the door and back again. His Tom Ford suit, once an armor of unchallenged authority, felt stiff on his shoulders, like a costume for a role he no longer knew how to play. He caught his reflection in the gleaming mahogany side table, a hollowed-out man with sunken eyes and gray at his temples. He quickly turned away. A memory drifted up, uninvited. A boy in a too-big hand-me-down coat, standing alone at a boarding school gate, while the town car that dropped him sped away without a backward glance. He'd learned young that control was the only way to keep people from leaving. Now the same lesson mocked him in the hush of this rented suite. In his mind, he ran through his strategies, scripts he'd rehearsed 1,000 times. He would begin with measured indignation, carefully laying out Charles's betrayal. Then, smoothly, he'd pivot to statesmanlike generosity, offering terms for the child's future that would unmask Charles's motives as purely self-serving. He would appear the calm, reasonable patriarch, wounded but rising above it all for the sake of his heir. He whispered these lines under his breath, but the words felt cheap, like forged money he was trying to pass in broad daylight. The titan of commerce was dead. What paced the plush suite now was just a cornered animal waiting for judgment. When the door latch clicked, it was as final as a judge's gavel. Alexander froze mid-step, turning stiffly toward the entrance, pulse thundering in his throat. Charles Whitcomb entered first. He moved with the unhurried ease of a man who discovered a power more enduring than wealth, the unshakable calm of a man at peace with himself. The soft lamplight found the silver in his hair, and when his eyes met Alexander's, there was no smirk, no hint of gloating, just a deep, unwavering clarity. The eyes of someone who had lived at the bottom and no longer feared the drop. Then Serena stepped past him into the room, and the air punched out of Alexander's chest. It hit him like a physical blow. It wasn't only the sight of her, heavily pregnant, her body bearing the undeniable mark of a new life. It was the peace that flowed off her in gentle waves. The woman who'd fled his penthouse had been a skittish creature of fear and desperate bravery. This woman was something entirely different, a living portrait of calm. She wore a simple navy dress that made no attempt to conceal her shape. If anything, it honored it. One hand rested on her belly, not like a guard but like an intimate bond, an easy, silent conversation between mother and child. She looked at him. And what shattered Alexander's final defenses wasn't hate. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even fear. It was pity. Quiet, merciful pity. The look one gives to a man raging behind soundproof glass, too consumed by his own noise to realize no one's listening. It stripped him bare. In her eyes, he wasn't a monster or a rival. He was simply irrelevant. "Alexander," Charles said, his voice calm and steady as a deep lake. He gestured politely to a small arrangement of plush armchairs clustered around a low glass table. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." The polished speeches, the carefully rehearsed tactics, everything turned to dust on Alexander's tongue. All that remained was the raw, bleeding wound in his chest. Let's skip the polite nonsense, Charles, he snapped, his own voice echoing thin and brittle in the suffocating quiet. You've won. You can drop the saint routine. He flung a trembling hand in Serena's direction. You've taken everything. My company's bleeding out. My name is poison. You have my wife, my child. His voice fractured on that final word, a humiliating crack in what used to be an unbreakable armor. Are you satisfied now? Is this the grand vengeance you dreamed about all those nights you rotted in obscurity? But it wasn't Charles who answered. It was Serena. She had been easing herself gracefully into one of the chairs, but at that, she paused, her voice gentle yet precise enough to split stone. This was never about revenge, Alexander. She spoke so softly, yet the words shredded his outrage like silk through a blade. This was about rescue. He let out a jagged, humorless laugh. Rescue? Rescue from what? From a penthouse with a skyline view? From a life where you never lacked for a single thing? I gave you a world royalty would envy. You gave me a cage, she said unflinching. Her eyes held his without a flicker of fear. A gorgeous gilded cage, its bars made of your rules and your expectations. You didn't want a wife, you wanted a perfectly polished showpiece for your collection. She drew a slow breath. Do you remember when I begged you to help fund that tiny art therapy program for kids in Bronzeville? I was so hopeful, so proud. And you laughed. You called it sweet but pointless. Then you wrote a giant check to the MCA instead and told me to chair a gala because that made for a better headline. You didn't just dismiss my idea, Alexander, you dismissed me. The memory flickered in his mind, vague, insignificant to him then, but now revealed as a fracture line that had split her wide open. He had no rebuttal for it. So he pivoted like he always did, toward the bigger enemy. He locked his glare on Charles, spitting the words like acid. A friend, huh? He sneered. Don't pretend. You found an opening and you pounced. A lonely, neglected wife married to your greatest rival. Don't stand there and sell this as some selfless mercy mission. Charles held his gaze, steady and unyielding. Charles didn't snap back. He didn't match Alexander's venom with his own. Instead, he leaned forward, hands resting loosely on his knees, like a patient professor settling in to explain a hard truth. When you orchestrated my downfall, he began, his voice calm and reflective, I lost my wealth. I lost my status. And for a long time, I drifted through life like a ghost, believing you had stolen everything. But once the lawyers left, once the creditors faded into memory, I realized you'd only taken what could be tallied in ledgers. He paused, letting that truth echo in the air between them. The things that truly matter, your mind, your values, the love of your family, the trust of honest friends, those can't be stolen. They can only be surrendered. And you, Alexander, you gave them up willingly. He let the words breathe in the quiet room before continuing. I spent 3 years at Oxford, not studying finance, but philosophy. I learned to recognize worth that doesn't appear on a balance sheet. I met Serena at that fundraiser you wrote off as trivial. You were across the ballroom that night, basking in spotlights, shaking hands with some senator, the center of your own universe. Everyone else existed merely to orbit you. Charles's eyes softened at the memory. I saw her standing alone near a children's painting, a wild, chaotic burst of color no auction house would ever touch. But she looked at it with a wonder deeper than you ever spared for the Warhol hanging above your fireplace. So I asked her what she saw. He smiled faintly. She told me she saw hope. She saw raw freedom, expression untouched by price tags or prestige. We talked for an hour and you never even noticed she was gone. He shifted slightly, voice steady but carrying an iron edge now. My friendship with her started that night. It had nothing to do with you. It had everything to do with the bright, passionate, brilliant woman you were quietly suffocating every single day. Alexander's vision swam, vertigo rolling through him as if the entire floor had lurched sideways. He clung desperately to his version of events, gasping. So you deny you plotted this? You deny this was all a plan to destroy me? I deny that your ruin was ever my primary goal, Charles said, the steel in his tone unmistakable now. My aim was to build something true, a business rooted in ethics, a community built on real human bonds, and a safe place for Serena, a woman I cherished as a dear friend, to rediscover her voice. He leaned closer, words precise as a scalpel. Your downfall, Alexander, is nothing but the natural collapse of a life built on fear, leverage, and intimidation. It was always coming. You built your empire, your marriage, on sand, and the tide has come in, on sand. The phrase exploded in Alexander's brain, obliterating every lie he had used to armor himself. In that blinding, suffocating flash of clarity, he saw it all. The betrayal of Charles not as a stroke of genius, but the desperate swing of a man terrified of being second best. He saw his marriage to Serena for what it really was, not a union, but an acquisition. So, that's how it ends. Or maybe, how it begins, my wonderful friends. You're still here with me, right? If you're hearing my voice right now, I know this story touched something deep inside you, just like it did for me while telling it. You see, Alexander Grayson's rise and ruin isn't just some dramatic revenge tale. It's a mirror. It reminds us that no tower of wealth can anchor a soul that's hollow inside. He built everything on fear, on controlling others, on chasing power to silence the little boy inside him who was once left alone at that boarding school gate. And when the storms came, it all washed away, because it was built on sand. Marcus Aurelius, the great Stoic emperor, wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Charles understood this truth. Serena learned it painfully. But Alexander? He never did. And so he lost the only things worth having: love, peace, family, trust. Maybe you and I were not billionaires in penthouses. But every one of us is tempted to trade our present peace for hollow status. We chase applause, we ignore people who love us most. We build walls thinking they protect us, but often they just trap us alone inside. So if you feel something stirring right now, promise me you'll remember this. You are enough right now. Kindness matters more than power. Love is stronger than control. And no empire is worth more than your peace of mind. If this story moved you, please like this video, share it with someone who needs this reminder, and hit that subscribe button. I can't wait to keep bringing you more tales that stir your heart and feed your mind. Thank you for staying till the last word. You're not alone. See you in the next story.